Okay, so the first graph you can see here is talking about from the version 1.1 standards. So it talks about the simple yes/no question: do you have a documented process for the standard, and does it align with the HQCC standard? So you can see that around July, September, we had on average around about 6 standards that facilities were saying yes, that they have a process that aligns with, and that's improved markedly up to around 8.5 or so in the second last round of reporting. So we've seen an improvement in process reporting. So this graph has a few sections, but if you look at, for the moment, at the bottom, which is overall, what we've got is a number of different bars on this graph which show the monitoring capability that facilities have. So what ability do they have to provide information for themselves and to the HQCC about the implementation of the standard. So each of the different bars in the different colours is a different reporting period, and it's nice to see that as time moves on, that the monitoring capability has improved overall. So the first one is we've reduced the reporting requirements by almost half. We've heard what a lot of people have been saying and what's been echoed here today, that some of the reporting requirements have been difficult for you and are starting to take people away from the quality improvement. That wasn't what we want to do, so we've reduced the reporting requirements where we can. What we've introduced in this reporting requirements is this concept of measures, which is usually a numeric rate which is used to assess your performance. So each of the data items is tied to a specific measure. The data items themselves are the actual questions. We've had a few questions already, and one of those is about we want one set of responses for the 12-month period. So we understand in a 12-month period you might be doing a series of audits, or you might have a series of information, but for our reporting purposes we want to keep that as simple as possible, so it'll be one set. So if you've got a couple of things, just conglomerate that into one thing. So all of the measures have been specifically designed to assess a specific part of compliance of the standards. So the yes/no questions talk about have you got a process, whereas the numeric rates talk about how well do you implement that process. So to get right down to what will the start reporting website look like, we'll be asking just the data items, but keep in mind that we will be turning those data items into a measure and calculating that for you. So what we've got is we're accepting hospital-based sample audits. And so within that, we want you to be aware that it's both the size and the makeup of that sample that's important. We've got some recommendations about the sample size in the reporting guide. And we've put together these recommendations based on some statistical analysis so that if you produce a sample audit of about that size and there is a real difference there, then you'll find that this sample size will be enough to spot it. There is to say these 3 questions follow a pattern. Do you have a process that has covered all criteria of the standard? Have you analysed the data, and have you then, from that analysis of the data, have you implemented any quality improvements associated with the standard? Talking about the first one is about a rate of the significant risks which have an active action plan. So this is a new indicator that we've added in, and so for this purpose we're talking about significant risks are those risks that you've identified and documented locally which have a high or extreme risk that you have locally assigned to that. And within that, so that will be the denominator, and the numerator for that measure will be the number of these significant risks which have an active action plan. Okay, I'll talk next about credentialing, and you'll have heard Cheryl talking about this earlier. We're upping the game on credentialing, where we've increased reporting. And most of the other standards, you're going to hear me talking about reduced reporting. Within credentialing, we've added some numeric measures. So there were no numeric measures before, but there are now. So it's focused, but what we're looking at as well is the number of eligible medical practitioners with credentials and a defined and documented scope of clinical practice at the local facility. So we're asking a specific targeted question about the number of eligible medical practitioners who have had a temporary or interim scope of practice, and then of those that have had consecutive terms of temporary or interim scope of clinical practice, because this is one area we've identified of specific risks. So that's something that So moving on to complaints management, you'll find that's relatively similar. We've had two additions we're making. So we're continuing the simple questions about the number of complaints and the number that you've received and closed and that have been open for longer than your specific policy. But we're adding in questions about complainant satisfaction. Okay, so within the review of hospital-related deaths, this is one of the stands where I can talk about a lot of questions have been removed. So we've removed the duplication of counts of deaths and counts of reviews by the community and by the hospital. So within the management of acute myocardial infarction standard, we're refocusing, it's generally very similar to what it was, but we're refocusing on the discharge and transfer plans. So to take up the question earlier, we're strongly focusing just on the discharge of patients after the acute management phase. And so I understand that is a bit of difference from what it was before. We're still interested, and it's still important that patients during the acute management phase have the appropriate medication, the appropriate clinical care, but this specific standard is based on evidence that talks about after discharge. At this point, I'd like to talk about contraindications and referral. We've had some questions about this, and some of this applies to some of the other standards. We are aware that with a lot of these rates and these measures, 100% is not ever going to happen. In the clinical world, specific patients will have a contraindication to aspirin or beta blockers, etc. We're fully aware of that, and however, we're not taking away that question because it's still an important question to ask, but what it requires is specific interpretation, careful interpretation by you and careful interpretation by us. The risk of venous thromboembolism. I've got a little summary here that says simplify and add medical patients. Adding medical patients, that's easy, isn't it? It's not. It's not. We understand that. So we understand that you saw from the graph that we already acknowledged that within local facilities, that is the standard that is most difficult to capture information on. That is we have the least monitoring capacity on that standard. However, the scientific evidence across the world and that's been described in the NHMRC guidelines was just too difficult for us not to work on. So we are acknowledging the difficulty, but taking a step forward and saying the scientific evidence is suggesting that there needs to be at least a risk assessment of medical patients.